We are almost to the end here. Chapter 15, Resistance. And this is the best way to describe this period in history. We hear sometimes, and Gamaliel in the book of Acts talks about the messiahs, the false religious leaders, political leaders who tried to rise up, who tried to take over before Christ came. But since many did not accept Christ as the Messiah, that continued. Actually, it got worse after Christ came. And some of the reasons for that we looked at last week is just for a few years, for a few short years, people in Israel were optimistic again. It was a kingdom. Herod Agrippa I, grandson of Herod the Great, was king. He had Hasmonean blood in him. And actually, there's a story that he was reading publicly from Deuteronomy, the section about the kings during one of the festivals of Israel. And he got to the part where it said that a king had to be chosen from among your brothers, that he couldn't be a foreigner. You shall not put a foreigner over you. And he started to weep because he saw himself as a foreigner. And those around him put their arms around him and said, "No, don't weep. You are our brother." That's how they saw him. And they loved him. People in general, the Jews, we think of him as a persecutor of the church. That was one of the reasons they did love him, is because he cared about their religion. And he did what pleased him. He worked very hard for their approval and succeeded far better than Herod the Great ever did, but only reigned for 3 years. After those 3 years, we have the incident where he got struck down for his pride. And he died very soon after that in AD 44. And at that point, his son was too young to take over, so Judea went back to being a Roman province. And from that point on, after that little taste of freedom and hope to be put back in that position that they were in before under Rome's direct control, chafed people terribly. And there was a steadily rising number from that point on of messianic and anti-Roman movements. People starting rebellions against the Roman government that was over them. So the official title for the governors of Judea before this point was prefect. Now it is procurator, but basically the same thing. So the first one they had after Herod Agrippa's death was, and I might not say all of these right, but Cuspius Fadus. And while Cuspius Fadus was governor, there was a Jewish revolutionary named Theodos who led a large group of followers to the Jordan River, claiming that he would make the water part and cause them to walk through on dry land, kind of a Joshua statement, or possibly an "I am the Elijah who was to come" statement, because that's something Elijah did as well. Either way, it was a rebellious religious movement. It was a statement against Rome. And Fadus sent a band of horsemen against him, a cavalry group, and they scattered the crowd. Theodos himself was beheaded. Same kind of thing during the time that Tiberius Julius Alexander was governor. He was actually a Jew from Alexandria, but he was an apostate Jew. He wasn't religiously a Jew anymore. He was pagan, but Jewish by birth, which didn't make him more popular, but less popular with the people. But during his time as governor, an uprising was started by two sons of Judas the Galilean, the one who started the big revolt back in AD 6. So his sons started their own revolt. They were defeated, and Alexander had them crucified. An apostate Jew crucifying people who were seen as very loyal, passionate. Yeah, people who wanted Jewish freedom. It didn't help his image. But really, all of these governors were in a impossible position. They couldn't both get along with their subjects and keep peace. The people simply didn't want them there. And there was nothing they could do to change that. Some of them made it incredibly worse. Some of them tried really hard. Cumanus was not one that tried very hard. Not a very good leader. A lot of things happened under him that shouldn't have. During the Passover, when Cumanus was procurator, a soldier made a rude gesture, exposed himself in front of the crowd that had gathered for the Passover, offended people in the temple terribly. They started to riot. So Cumanus responded by sending more soldiers to the temple area to keep the peace. The people thought the Romans are attacking us, they're going to slaughter us, so they panicked. And the temple did not have many exits. In the narrow entryways, the small places people had to get through to get out of the temple, there was a blockage. People trampled each other. A huge number of people died, not from the soldiers directly, but just trying to get out. And Cumanus, of course, is the person that people blamed for that, justly or unjustly. But one year, the things happened around festivals. Festivals were difficult times in which to keep peace. And one of the reasons for that is the tension between the Jews and the Samaritans. The Galileans traveled through Samaria and back for every festival. And one year, a Jew from Galilee was murdered by a Samaritan on his way south to celebrate the Feast of Booths in Jerusalem. And the Jews, of course, petitioned Cumanus for justice, asked him to take care of the situation, but possibly because the Samaritans bribed him or for some other reason, he chose to overlook the crime. He ignored it. But when news of this reached Jerusalem, those at the festival took matters into their own hands, made their own little army, and marched north and attacked some villages of the Samaritans. And that Cumanus did not ignore. And the Samaritans and Cumanus brought a charge against the Jews to Claudius, the emperor. And the Jews succeeded in getting Cumanus kicked out, accused him of partiality, of taking bribes, taking the Samaritans' side, and Cumanus got taken away and replaced. Herod Agrippa II, actually, remember he was young, too young to take over. He was still living in Rome, and he was able to convince Claudius to take the Jews' side in this debate, to convince him that Cumanus was the one responsible for the violence because of his neglect. So Cumanus was banished and replaced by Felix, which should be a familiar name, especially if you've read the book of Acts recently. Claudius was not always tolerant of and benevolent toward the Jews. We know at one point he ordered all of the Jews to leave Rome. And all of the background and the reasons for that we're not sure of, but Aquila and Priscilla. It says in Acts 18, 1 and 2, Paul found them in Corinth, a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, and his wife Priscilla, who recently came from Italy because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. So, but apparently that didn't, his problems that he had himself with the Jews, it didn't affect his relationship with Agrippa II. Agrippa II was very favored by Claudius, and he made him, Agrippa, king of the territory that had previously been ruled by Philip the Tetrarch. So he was made a king. Agrippa II was, but not of the same area, not of the whole country, just part of it. And Agrippa II co-ruled together with his sister Bernice, which might also sound like a familiar name. She's also mentioned in the book of Acts. But Bernice married multiple times, but Agrippa never did, which led to a rumor, whether true or not, that they had an incestuous relationship, which in that family would not have been incredibly surprising. But whether it's true or not, Agrippa II never married, never produced an heir. And the Herodian royal line ended with him. There was never a Herod who ruled after Agrippa II. But later in his life, Agrippa II became a friend of Josephus, personal friend. They wrote letters to each other, and Agrippa gave him a lot of the material that he used in his histories. So if you read Josephus's books, want to get the full story, then I'm just giving you snippets of here. A lot of that information, especially about the Herod family and the involvement that they had in things that went on, comes from him, most likely. But Claudius died eventually, and after the death of Claudius in AD 54, his grandnephew, Nero, became the last Caesarian Roman emperor. The Caesars did not actually continue to reign very long. Nero was the last Caesar to be emperor. And he was only 16 years old when he began to reign. We'll come back to Nero a little bit later. And we know when you think of Nero, you think of the fact that he did persecute Christians and was the first emperor to do so. But that was later in his reign. That wasn't for several years yet at this point. But the next governor of Judea was Felix, Marcus Antonius Felix. And he was a freedman, actually. He wasn't a noble by birth. He was a slave who had been set free. So it was very, very unusual for him to be put in a government position like this. But Felix was married to Agrippa II's sister. So they were related in that way. Drusilla, I believe. But this is something that happened during his governorship. In the Jewish war, it says, there was an Egyptian false prophet who got together 30,000 men who were deluded by him. And so pretty significant army. Again, Josephus's numbers, are a little bit suspect. But 30,000 men who were deluded by him. These he led round about from the wilderness to the Mount of Olives, and was ready to break into Jerusalem from that side, from the temple side, by force from that place and conquer the Roman garrison, which was right next to the temple. But Felix prevented his attempt and met him with his soldiers. The people of Jerusalem sided with the Romans. They didn't want their city attacked. They didn't necessarily go along with him just because he was Jewish. And that's something that we'll see, especially next week, is that it wasn't as simple as just the Romans against the Jews. There were a serious number of Jews that wanted peace and were destroyed along with those who wanted to fight. But in this case, the people of Jerusalem sided with the Romans against their fellow Jews. So that when it came to a battle, the Egyptian who was leading this Jewish group ran away with a few others, while most of those who were with him were either destroyed or taken alive. So the Egyptian escaped after this revolt. And would somebody like to look up and read Acts 21, 37 through 38? This event is actually referred to directly.
As the soldiers were about to take Paul, he asked the man, "May I say something to you? Do you speak Greek?" He replied, "Aren't you the Egyptian who sent Paul and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?"
Right, so 4,000 is a little bit more of a believable number than 30,000. But yeah, Paul was mistaken for this guy when this commotion started. Yeah, they thought of recent history and assumed the same uprising was starting again. But I like the translation terrorists there. Terrorist is an appropriate word for it. My translation says assassins. And of course, assassin is an older word, didn't come about till later, but the Greek word is Sicarios. Sicarios. And these people are mentioned. It's not just these people, it was a bigger group, not just those who followed the Egyptian. But Josephus says there sprang up a new group of brigands in Jerusalem. So not outside Jerusalem, not in the countryside, in Jerusalem, who were called Sicarii. They slew men in broad daylight and in the middle of the city. They joined the crowds at festivals. So when it was crowded, when people really couldn't tell what was going on, and they concealed daggers under their garments with which they stabbed their enemies. And when anyone fell down dead, the murderers immediately joined those around them in expressing shock and indignation, by which means they could by no means be discovered. So saying, "Whoa, who did that? Was it you? Was it you?" when they were the ones who did it, creating confusion in the crowds and getting away with murder in the middle of the day in crowds. And this is the earliest known group of organized assassins in world history. Actually, by about 1,000 years, they have everybody else beat. And their targets were not all necessarily Romans. It would have been more dangerous to go after Romans. There would have been a more serious investigation when they went after Romans. But their main targets were Jews who were not radical, who were not zealots, who were willing to cooperate with Rome. One of their earliest and most famous victims was the former high priest. We've mentioned him already, Jonathan, the son of Annas, the one who replaced Caiaphas. He was killed by the Sicarii for being moderate, for simply not wanting to go to war. So there was an atmosphere of fear that pervaded Jerusalem and the Jewish people. You were either with the radicals or you were against them. But in Acts 24 through 27, I'll go ahead and read this one. This is after Paul's arrest. Some days later, after Paul had already been moved from Jerusalem to Caesarea, Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewish. That's, Agrippa II's sister there, and summoned Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. But as he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix became frightened and answered, "Go away for the present, and when I find time, I will call for you." At the same time, he was also hoping that money would be given him by Paul. Therefore, he also used to summon for him quite often and converse with him. Okay. But like those who came before him, Felix, despite his best efforts, and he is one of those who tried, he could not manage to both maintain peace and stay on good terms with the Jews. Just putting down revolts that he had to put down made him unpopular. And Felix was eventually recalled to Rome by Nero. And verse 27. But after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul imprisoned. So Porcius Festus is the next one. And let's just go ahead and keep reading in Acts. In Acts 25, 1 through 5. Festus then, having arrived in the province, after 3 days went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the leading men of the Jews brought charges against Paul, and they were pleading with him, requesting a favor against Paul, that he might have him brought to Jerusalem, while they set an ambush to kill him on the way. So, because they knew he hadn't done anything the Romans would consider worthy of death, that was their plan, to get him to Jerusalem or sent to Jerusalem and kill him on the way. Festus then answered that Paul was being kept in custody at Caesarea, and that he himself was about to leave shortly. Therefore, he said, "Let the influential men among you go down there with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them accuse him." And later down in the chapter, after they brought the charges, and Paul spoke in his own defense, and in verse 8, Paul said in his own defense, "I have committed no sin either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar." But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and to be tried before me on these matters?" But Paul said, "I am standing before Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of those things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." Then when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, "You have appealed to Caesar you shall go." And this isn't something that he had to do because Paul was a Roman citizen. Not every Roman citizen could get a trial before Caesar himself just by asking for it, but it was a good way to make it not his problem. And he accepted it. Now, when several days had passed, King Agrippa and Bernice, his sister, arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And Acts 25:23, on the next day, after Festus had kind of gone over with Agrippa what the situation was, when Agrippa came together with Bernice amid great pomp and entered the hall, accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at the order of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen here present with us, you see this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. Yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my lord. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems absurd to me, in sending a prisoner, not to indicate also the charges against him. And Christianity wasn't really a widely known and recognized thing. Later on in history, not much later on, he could have just said, this man is a Christian, and gotten him a death sentence with Nero for that reason. But there is pretty good evidence, a few good reasons to believe that Paul was imprisoned more than once at Rome, that this first time he went to Rome, he was released and then later rearrested and killed. But that's a church history thing. Now Agrippa said to Paul, you are permitted to speak for yourself. Then Paul, stretching out his hand, began to make his defense. And he tells the whole story of his conversion. And he goes further in explaining some things than he ever went with Festus. Because down in verse 24 of chapter 26, it says, now when Paul was saying this in his defense, Festus said in a loud voice, Paul, you are out of your mind. Great learning is driving you out of your mind. It was obvious that Paul had studied. He was quoting the Old Testament all over the place. He was making connections between prophecies and what had been fulfilled by Christ. But Paul said, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth. For the king knows about these matters, and I speak to him also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you believe. Which tells you something about this family and how they were viewed. I mean, compared to the Romans especially, it had gotten to the point where they really were accepted. They had the acceptance they wanted a little bit too late to be able to hold on to that power and authority. But they had a Jewish culture. They believed, or at least claimed to believe, the Jewish scriptures. But Agrippa replied to Paul, in such short time are you persuading me to become a Christian? And Paul said, I would pray to God that whether in a short or long time, not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. And the king stood up, and the governor, and Bernice, and those who were sitting with them. And when they had gone aside, they began talking to one another, saying, this man is not doing anything worthy of death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. And yeah, that Caesar that Paul appealed to was Nero. So let's talk a little bit more about him. Nero was a very controversial emperor. Some people loved him, some people absolutely hated him. He was generally liked by the common people. He did extravagant things. He was an exciting person to have as a ruler. He was not liked very well at all by the upper class, by people who actually had to deal with him. And most of our information about him comes from his enemies, and a lot of it contradicts itself. So how bad the guy actually was is still pretty debated. But something just about everyone agrees on is that he was the first emperor to systematically persecute Christians, to seek out and kill Christians, and he did it very brutally. This is from a Roman historian, not a Christian, named Tacitus, talking about the aftermath of the great fire that swept through Rome. A fire destroyed a great portion of the city of Rome. Nero started rebuilding it in a grander style. People took offense. People started spreading the rumor Nero started the fire. It was his plan. He had no regard for our lives and our property. And Tacitus says, all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiation of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the fire had been set on Nero's orders. There was nothing he could do to get people to stop saying this. So, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the common people. Group of people already didn't trust, already didn't like. And Tacitus says, Christus, from whom the name Christian came, suffered the extreme penalty, which means he was executed, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. So that's the perspective of a pagan historian on this, which is actually a really useful, valuable confirmation of biblical history, that Jesus really did live, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. We would know that even if we didn't have the Gospels. But this is something that a Christian historian, or apologist actually, Tertullian, wrote later in his defense of Christianity. Consult your histories, and you will find that Nero was the first who wielded the imperial sword against the Christian sect, making progress especially at Rome. But we glory in having our condemnation hallowed, made holy, by the hostility of such a wretch. For anyone who knows him can understand that Nero never condemned anything unless it was of singular excellence. The fact that Nero condemned Christianity is proof of how good Christianity was, is what he's saying. So Nero had a reputation, even among non-Christians, for being a pretty terrible person overall. But the attitude of the Jews toward the Romans and the attitude of Paul and his fellow Christians toward their government could not have been more different. And Paul's attitude is expressed in 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 4, a very familiar passage. And I'll go ahead and read this one too, since we are at the end of our time. Paul says, first of all, then, I exhort that petitions and prayers, requests and thanksgivings be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. This is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and to come to the full knowledge of the truth. And this is our attitude toward authority, even terrible authority, even authority we don't like, even authority that persecutes us. We win them over not by rebelling, but by being model subjects. It's very similar to what Peter says to wives. If they have an unbelieving husband, win him over, convince him of the truth of the gospel, the power of the gospel, by behaving unnaturally in that situation, by giving back peace when you're handed brutality. Because to rebel is natural. To submit requires far greater strength. To lead tranquil and quiet lives in all godliness and dignity. Because our desire for their salvation should be greater than our desire for personal freedom, our desire to protect our rights. Eternal concerns should be topmost in our minds, not temporal concerns. His kingdom is not of this world. We don't fight with the world's weapons. We don't fight according to the world's ways. Any thoughts, questions about what we've gone over this morning? All right, next week we're going to see the conflict between the Jews and the Romans come to a head and finish off this series. So, Father, thank you for the confidence that we can have in you, the peace in any situation, under any government. Help us to be an example to others of peace, of hope, not looking to make this world perfect and resting our hope in that possibility. We know that it won't be. But to fix all of our hope on you and your victory. And thank you for enabling us to have victory now over the real enemy of sin. And help us to be faithful in praying for our leaders and praying for each other, for those who are being persecuted today for their faith. Let's remember what we're part of. And glorify yourself through us, through your church, in all the world. In Jesus' name, amen.